The day was young on May 1, 1940, as the fog began to set in across Lake Superior. The SS Arlington sailed through the gloom, its crew becoming increasingly tetchy as conditions on the Great Lake began to deteriorate. This fog, it was becoming clear, was transforming into a terrible storm. The ship's first mate sought to act fast, directing the crew to head towards the shore, but his captain overruled him. Captain Frederick Burke, in an act of apparent madness, ordered his crew to sail deeper into the storm. It was a horrible decision, but it wouldn't be his last, not quite. 8 decades on, Lake Superior explorers find vessel that mysteriously claimed captain's life. It had been about 4:30 a.m. on that fateful morning when the Arlington succumbed to the storm, and the damage really started to tell. The ship began to founder, and, once that grim process was underway, there was no stopping it. The vessel sank quickly. And here's where things get a little creepy. When the crew realized that the ship was beyond help, they fled. They made for the lifeboats and got off as quickly as they could. But Captain Burke chose to stay put. The captain stayed on board the Arlington right until the bitter end. Yet just before the ship was lost to the sea, in those final, critical moments, witnesses noticed something frightfully eerie. Burke put his hand in the air and waved and then reportedly disappeared forever. To this day, Captain Burke's behavior remains a source of macabre fascination. Why did he make such a bad decision in the first place, and why, having made that choice to sail into the storm, did he simply accept his fate? Why did he allow himself to be swallowed up by the icy waters? More than 8 decades have now passed since the sinking of the Arlington, and the questions about what happened have largely remained unanswered. That's hardly a surprise, given that the shipwreck's precise location wasn't known. But that situation, finally, has changed. In February 2024, some big news suddenly emerged. The Arlington had been found. At a depth of something like 600 feet beneath the surface of Lake Superior, the vessel had been waiting. So, we know where it is at last, but does that mean we'll finally be able to learn more about what happened on the day it was lost? Maybe. The wreck was found some distance off the shores of Michigan, deep in the waters of Lake Superior. The circumstances behind its discovery stretch back a number of years to when a researcher named Dan Fountain noticed something unusual. Fountain's specialism is data analysis, and he was looking at information obtained by remote sensing technology which had been deployed at the lake. This tech was specifically designed to help reveal shipwrecks beneath the surface. Fountain noticed that its findings pointed towards the presence of one such object 35 miles or so off the shoreline. He reached out to an organization called the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society, GLSHS, to let it know. The GLSHS was very much the right body for Fountain to contact. Set up in 1978, it boasts divers and teachers among its ranks, and its members know the wreck-strewn waters of Lake Superior better than most. In 2023, the group was in a position to dispatch a remote-operated vehicle to the site that Fountain had identified. The submersible sank down at great depth, and sure enough it came upon a shipwreck with some discernible letters on the hull. They read Arlington. The Arlington is far from alone in the depths of Lake Superior. Across its 32,000 square miles, the lake is littered with literally hundreds of wrecks, some of them are rather famous. Any fans of folk singer Gordon Lightfoot, for instance, will surely know the tale of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Lightfoot's song immortalized the Edmund Fitzgerald, which went under in 1975 at the cost of 29 lives. Another ship lost in Lake Superior was the Atlanta, a schooner which went down in 1891 and was finally located again in 2022. New technologies have meant that the multitude of shipwrecks at the bottom of Lake Superior have become quite a bit easier to locate of late. The use of sonar and satellites have revolutionized the practice, meaning so many of the vessels that were lost can now be pinpointed and investigated. You might wonder why there are so many shipwrecks at the bottom of this particular body of water. Well, the simple answer is that it's long been a vital trade route, with a history, in that respect, stretching back hundreds of years. And large amounts of traffic, inevitably, means more sinkings. The way the technology involved in these shipwreck searches is deployed is pretty fascinating. When the lake floor is disturbed by the movement of currents, remote sensing instruments pick up unusually shaped objects in the data transmitted to the surface. Further sonar technology will then be deployed to seek confirmation. A side-scanning sonar device maps the lake floor and any objects resting there by pinging soundwave pulses down and receiving them back again. If this procedure, too, suggests there's something of note down there, it's time to send down the remote-operated vehicle. The submersible is equipped with lights and a camera, allowing the experts operating it to see what it approaches. Hulls, steering wheels, sails, personal items belonging to the crew, whatever it might be, the vehicle and its camera are invaluable in revealing the secrets at the bottom of the lake. To be clear, it's not very often that a shipwreck is brought to the surface once it's been found. That would be one expensive operation. But being able to see it through the cameras of the submersible can still be very useful for research purposes. The footage of the Arlington that the submersible managed to capture proved especially revealing. A short clip was uploaded onto the GLSHS website, in which we can see features like a smokestack, rudder stick, wheel, and even toilet bowl with a decent amount of clarity. We can also hear the voices of the submersible's operators. "Okay, I'm coming up on something," one such person can be heard saying as the vehicle approaches the long-lost ship. "Boy, this is a mess." Getting to the point of being able to see the wreckage through the submersible's camera had been tough. So many different people had needed to step up, as Bruce Lynn, the GLSHS's executive director, remarked in a statement. "One of the most important aspects of everything we do as an organization involves the concept of teamwork," he said. "This goes for our operations at Whitefish Point, as well as on the water aboard the David Boyd. We are lucky to have so many dedicated shipwreck historians and researchers as friends of GLSHS. Incidentally, the David Boyd is a research vessel that was used as part of this operation." Lynn went on to praise the work of Fountain in particular, given that the operation had ultimately borne fruit because he directed GLSHS to the right spot. "These targets don't always amount to anything," Lynn said of Fountain's tip, "but this time it absolutely was a shipwreck." He went on, "A wreck with an interesting and perhaps mysterious story. Had Dan not reached out to us, we might never have located the Arlington, and we certainly wouldn't know as much about her story as we do today." Fountain himself was delighted with the discovery he'd helped to reveal. He spoke to the New York Times about it, noting, "It solved a mystery," saying, "We now have an X on the map instead of a blur in this area. We are happy to have found it." Of course, behind the wreckage lies a terrible tragedy, which isn't a fact that was lost on Fountain. He went on, "But it is also sobering when you realize it is also Captain Burke's grave." Fountain hopes the discovery of the wreckage will serve a greater purpose than simply satisfying the curiosity of shipwreck hunters and enthusiasts. While, in a statement, he did acknowledge that the operation was exciting in those terms, he went on to stress the potential importance of the discovery to Burke's descendants. "It's exciting to solve just one more of Lake Superior's many mysteries," he acknowledged, he said. "I hope this final chapter in the Arlington's story can provide some measure of closure to the family of Captain Burke." That's a kind sentiment, but the truth is that the wreckage holds no real clues as to what happened inside Captain Burke's mind on that fateful day when his ship went under. Only the man himself could have known, so that leaves us in the imperfect position of speculating. While the discovery of the wreckage is amazing, it hasn't changed that fact. Burke's behavior on that last journey was inexplicably weird. Once his ship was loaded with wheat at Ontario's Port Arthur on April 30, 1940, he and his crew set off. But it wasn't long before trouble found them in the form of the storm. Burke had captained many voyages by this stage in his life. A man of his experience should have figured that this storm posed some serious risks to his ship, but for some reason he sailed right through it. He sailed into danger when he should have known better. Corey Adkins, who serves as the Director of Content and Communications at GLSHS, spoke to the Washington Post about that, saying, "That lake will take you in a second if you don't keep your eye on it." And Captain Burke that night did not keep his eye on it. The crew was certainly worried by what was happening, as demonstrated by the first mate Eunice Maxey ordering the ship towards the shore. Why Burke put a stop to Maxey's order from being carried out is a mystery, but he did. The Arlington instead sailed towards its doom. Reports written around the time the ship was lost have claimed the crew were utterly bewildered by what their captain was telling them to do. But what could they do? Short of mutiny, their only option was to follow orders. When it became clear that the damage to the vessel inflicted by the storm had reached a critical stage, the crew knew they needed to get off. The Arlington was beginning to sink, so they couldn't just stand there and await their fate. But no word had yet come from their captain. Right as this unthinkable catastrophe was playing out, Burke was nowhere to be seen. But, with the vessel sinking at a shockingly swift rate, the crew decided to act without him. They couldn't wait any longer, so they made for the lifeboats. It was time to abandon ship. It wasn't going to be an easy escape. A lot of ice had built up on the ship during the voyage, meaning it was incredibly difficult for the sailors to free the lifeboats. They had been frozen in place. After desperate efforts, they eventually managed to get them into the water. Speaking to the Windsor Star after he and his crewmates had been rescued, the Arlington's chief engineer, Fred Gilbert, remarked that he'd been forced to leave all his possessions aboard the vessel as it sank. There was no time to grab anything, not even his coat. As the crew made for safety in the lifeboats, something odd became clear. Their captain still wasn't with them. He'd stayed behind, on board the sinking Arlington. And it seemed as though he was waving to them as he sank to his death upon the vessel. That must have been a disturbing sight for any of the crew members who saw it happen. But beyond that, it must have been so confusing. Why wouldn't Burke have tried to save himself? Why did he so readily accept a watery death? Speaking to the New York Times, Fountain addressed this puzzle of what had been going on with Burke. The question, Fountain began, is whether he was saying, "Hey, hold the lifeboat," or waving goodbye. We'll probably never know. As for the crew, some felt that Burke had taken ill when the vessel started sinking. Others say he'd slipped and fallen. Both cases might explain why he'd stayed where he was, but neither theory seems especially convincing. There is, of course, an old adage of the sea that you've probably heard of, and it may be relevant to this tale. It says a captain must go down with his ship. It's a well-known tradition that even non-sailors tend to be aware of, so can that explain what was going on with Burke that day? Was he adhering to a tradition in which he genuinely believed? Well, it's certainly possible. After all, the notion of a captain going down with a ship is one that's taken very seriously indeed by seafarers. In some cases, it's literally enshrined in law. The Arlington's chief engineer Gilbert certainly felt the tradition of captaining going down with the ship might have been a factor in Burke's decision to stay on board. And given that he was there that day, perhaps it's something to take seriously? He just wouldn't leave his ship, Gilbert remarked to the Windsor Star after the sinking. That rule of the sea that a master must stick with his ship doesn't only apply to the Navy. But here's the thing about the idea of a captain going down with the ship. It's not actually meant to be understood in a literal sense. That's not to say the tradition isn't very real and taken seriously by those at sea, but there are nuances contained within it. It's not as straightforward as it sounds. If a vessel is sinking, it's the captain's responsibility to ensure the crew makes it off safely. They have to direct everyone off the ship, which means it's necessary for them to stay on board until the end. Only when everyone else is off is the captain freed of that duty. In a 2014 column for the New York Times Magazine entitled "Must a Captain Always Go Down with the Ship?" the writer Chuck Klosterman dispels the myth of the tradition. In the plainest of terms, he wrote, "The captain is not obligated to drown on principle." Klosterman went on, "The value of a ship itself is not greater than the value of the person controlling it. Even if the captain's own negligence results in hundreds of deaths, it's not his symbolic duty to add his life to the total." There are certainly famous instances where a captain really did elect to sink with his ship. Most famously, of course, there was Captain Edward John Smith, who stayed aboard the Titanic as it descended into the icy depths. But, as Klosterman was at pains to point out in his column, it isn't a reasonable job expectation. Assuming the captain of a sinking ship gets everyone off safely, his duty, in this respect at least, is done. If he's no longer in a position to save anyone else, Klosterman wrote, he can absolutely save himself. We can only assume that Burke knew perfectly well that the maxim about a captain going down with his ship wasn't to be taken literally. The man was an experienced sailor. He'd seen his crew escape on the lifeboats, so he very reasonably could have made good on his own escape. But, for whatever reason, he didn't. As GLSHS's Lynn put it in an interview quoted by the New York Times, the stereotype is that the captain goes down with the ship. But there was plenty of time for that captain to get out of his pilot house and be part of that crew that was going to be rescued. Lynn reflected to the New York Times, "The last man in the wheelhouse simply said he was not coming." There is speculation about this veteran of the lakes. Why was he acting the way he was acting? What was happening in those final moments? The truth is that we'll probably never know. Even though the discovery of the Arlington's wreck is exciting, it does nothing to shine a light into the state of mind of its captain. His fatal decisions were understood only by him. Burke's nearest and dearest, too, were left in total bafflement by what had happened. His brothers were waiting along the shore as the rescue mission was underway, helpless as their siblings sank to the bottom of the lake. Even they couldn't wrap their head around the strange tale. It's perhaps this mystery that makes the tale of Burke and the Arlington is so gripping. It's a haunting story that poses difficult questions, and it doesn't provide any easy answers. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.